And we're back.
Hello.
Hello, friends. We are back for the 5th module today of an introduction to single-page applications.
Okay, not spas.
I almost said spa. Almost said spa. And I'm going to continue just to give you an introduction to AngularJS in specific. We're going to talk about some of the things about AngularJS and then kind of compare how do you move from jQuery and that mindset to how you move to Angular.
Yeah.
Look at some of the code little differences in terms of the finished application.
Right.
Then after that, I promise you, we'll be getting into code.
Hey, no fair. Why do you get 2 sessions on Angular and we only get 1 on jQuery?
Well, you know.
Some sort of preference from one or the other?
Yeah.
That's what it might be, too.
Yeah. I'm a heightist.
Yeah.
So talking about introduction to Angular, what we're going to talk about just briefly is the what and whys of AngularJS. Why would you use it? What about it? What do you need to know? We're going to talk about jQuery to AngularJS. Since we started the morning doing jQuery, we're going to talk about what does that mean?
The transition.
Do they play well together? Should they play well together? That kind of thing. I'm going to walk you through some common AngularJS taxonomy. We're going to talk about just common things that, what they're called in Angular, kind of what they mean. I'm only going to, cover 4 or 5. They have a whole, their documentation is pretty phenomenal. So you can go through and kind of get that. But I just want to walk you through a couple of the ones. We'll probably be using 1 or 2 of them. And then I want to walk you through how does AngularJS actually work, and that's often considered the bootstrapping. Okay. So when you put in the page, how does it know to do what it needs to do?
What's the science behind it?
Well, I don't know if I'm going to get that far, but I don't know if you want me to do the science behind it.
Okay.
But I'll definitely walk you through the steps that it takes so that you understand what is happening in the page. So let's go to the what and whys of AngularJS. So why would you use AngularJS over another framework?
Right. We showed all these other frameworks before: Ember, Knockout, Backbone.
So many of them. So many. And so why are we going to use AngularJS? And so one thing that's really great about it is it's open source.
Okay.
Right?
I like it.
We love open source.
That's right. Especially at Microsoft now.
Yeah, bring it. Love all the open source.
We have an entire open source tech building in Studio 9. So it shows you we're really making a push for open source at this point. Yeah,
but open source framework. It's maintained by Google and community. There's a lot of people who are involved with it. It's very active, and that's one of the things you need to look at when you're choosing a framework. Is that is it active? Is it continually being updated?
Yeah.
Are people committing? What is the GitHub repo? For example, if you want to look at that.
Yes.
How often are you seeing commits? Things like that.
That's a good sign. Right?
Yeah.
A sign of healthiness behind a framework. The fact that it's constantly being updated.
Well, so you might go somewhere, whether it be like Codeplex or Bitbucket or GitHub or wherever. You might go to any of those communities, search for something, and then you'll see, oh, the last time it's been updated was a year ago, and then all the comments are not positive. Why do you want to use that?
Right.
You might, because it might actually provide you with what you need. But if you're constantly having to go back and look under the hood, you're wasting your time under the hood. So that's one reason why you might choose something like Angular. It's got a lot of backing. It's pretty prominent.
Yeah, if you find a framework that's being hosted on AngelFire or a GeoCities site.
Back with the 80s again.
Go the other way.
Yeah. So, and if it's next to a banner that has the punch the monkey thing or whatever it was, like where you had to go chase it.
And it was done in Flash.
Hey.
I know.
Be kind to Flash.
Oh
my gosh. So, coming back to Angular, I feel like we're always doing this round circle. It's an MVC framework, right, for dynamic web applications. So it does give you that strong kind of structure that you might need to create something a little bit more robust. It gives you the foundation for all of the harder things to do. It's what you need if you're going to have to do binding and routing and the beauty about Angular is it does so much more than that, and a lot of people don't realize you can do animations, you can do all sorts of stuff with it. So it's really, it is, if I called jQuery a Swiss Army knife, in many ways Angular is a really robust, mature Swiss Army knife in that sense.
Yeah, definitely.
It extends, the one thing about Angular versus other frameworks is that it actually extends HTML. And so, what does that even mean to the, a person who's like, what does extending HTML mean?
They might be thinking like the data tag. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah,
right.
But it actually kind of extends HTML, and it allows you to, add new functionality. It does two-way binding, which is something that most frameworks don't do.
Yeah.
They do one way. So if you change it here or there,
right, in the view or the model,
it's going to synchronize, and so that saves you a lot of work. The one thing about Angular that I like, and I like it once we compare it to something like jQuery, it's got a declarative UI and imperative business logic. And what I mean by declarative UI is that when you look at the HTML, you look at the view, you understand what should be happening and why. Mm-hmm. So you're not looking at something and thinking, oh, well, it says there's a class in jQuery, it says drop down.
Yeah.
Is that going to be a drop down list?
There's like some voodoo magic making it all happen behind the scenes.
Where do I look? Like, do I go here? Do I go there?
Yeah.
And so the one thing about Angular is you read it and you at least have a very good sense of what should be going on. And so once we kind of walk through that, I'll show you an example. Now, why AngularJS? So, widely embraced by the web development community, very active creating resources. We love AngularJS. You can start to see templates that are available in terms of Visual Studio. There's IntelliSense for it. If you're using something like Web Essentials, we are strongly invested in AngularJS. It's very well adopted by enterprise. So, that's definitely something else where that these people and teams of people are building robust applications that require all sorts of things that on an average day we might not have to account for.
It's not just like the mom and pop shops or the web developer at home or a small studio.
Right. It can be the teams of 20 people who are creating that, banking application or whatever it may be. And so, Angular is very popular amongst them. And the other reason why you might want to consider AngularJS over something else, I've already mentioned some of these things, but two-way data binding, it includes templating. The templating is actually not treated as a string. It's treated as HTML.
Okay.
You have dependency injection.
I like it.
So dependency injection basically means that you're reducing or you're trying to avoid coupling by injecting references or dependencies that people might need in that chunk of code. So, that way you don't have all these dependencies across the board.
Yeah.
You're just injecting them. It has what's called directives, and directives...
now we're talking.
Well, directives are like one of those things where we won't get into directives today, but, it's either...
a high-level overview.
Well, it's you got to be full in or full out.
That's right.
It's one of those things where we can't cover it all, but...
Kind of putting our hand in the cookie jar.
Yeah, a little bit, and then slapping it.
Yeah.
So directives are kind of like, some people call them different things. To me, I think of them as widgets or components kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's where you might kind of mess with the DOM a little bit. You can mark it up in a certain way. And so when you start to look at it, you'll see that, it's got a different name. It looks like it's, something else. And so someone coming from, when I first looked at this and I was like, I used to be a Flex developer, I started laughing. I was like, I totally know what this is. I get this. So, that's another reason, testable. Once again, very, very testable. And just extensibility across the board for Angular are some of the reasons why you might consider it. I think most people who use it and they select it for a reason, it's usually because of the two-way data binding. So that's really, and the directives really what makes it, very, very different than other ones.
Yeah, oh yeah.
So if we're moving from jQuery to AngularJS, we saw basic ways to do single page app. With jQuery, we're going to look at AngularJS now. And when you look at AngularJS, it requires you to do a little bit of a mind shift. And so jQuery to AngularJS, often people will start to use Angular and then they still rely on jQuery and they don't realize everything that Angular has. And that it might have everything that you need.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that, if you're going to move to Angular and you haven't tried it and you're very familiar with jQuery, if you're trying to do something and you're feeling like you need to depend on jQuery for it, you're doing a DOM selection or manipulation, you want to do animation, any of that kind of stuff, go and see if you can do it in Angular.
That's right.
Pose a question, go to Stack Overflow, do a search, go to the docs.
Yeah.
You will be pleasantly surprised that most of the stuff you can probably do in Angular.
Yeah, and again, this isn't to like knock one language or a framework or library over another, but it's just they're there to substitute one thing or another and make your life easier as a developer or team.
Yeah, I mean, and the thing is if you could achieve that in Angular, why add the extra library if you don't need it? And so, once again, it's just one of those things that requires a bit of a mind shift. jQuery, to me, is often seen as augmentation. You've got a page and you're going to augment it. You want to add some bells and whistles. You want to add some behavior. You're augmenting it. It's not really about infrastructure. And so when you think about Angular, Angular is about infrastructure. It's about being very focused on the architecture of an application. Yep. You're going to think about the application. Yeah. You're going to think about the resources you need and the services that you need. Yeah. You're going to think about how it works, and then you're going to start to put it together. Right. So it's not about web pages. Yeah. Right? It's more about how do these things interact and what's the UX between them. It's kind of like maybe an architect kind of designing and building everything before they kind of get to the project itself. Yeah, completely. I mean, this is a perfect opportunity for you to be like, here's all the services we're going to need. Yes. Here's all the views that we're going to need. Here's all those things. And the other beauty behind that is if you kind of think and you take that approach to your web application, this more like an architectural focus, you can start to see that they'll break apart into modules or into little doable chunks, which means that it's easier to work on a team. Yeah, so you think it's worth the time to take time up front to design and build these things together before you just jump into it? I think it's it's totally worth the time, but I also think that you need to consider what kind of a project are you doing? Are you doing just a simple, like, show me all the latest Instagram photos and it has no functionality? Yeah. Maybe you can just use jQuery. Right. Maybe, maybe that's fine. But, are you building something that actually goes and searches all these Instagram photos and then you get to, save some of them and then there's a login and then, it's more of an application. Storefront, some sort of authentication. You might be looking at something like Angular. So I think that, it really depends. A lot of people with frameworks, they find that there's a lot of overhead in getting started and that there's a learning curve. Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's always going to be, right? No matter what you do. Right, but then you start to realize that some of the learning stuff that you put into it, you're going to get back. And with Angular, that's very much the case. That's right, and the peace of mind, knowing that you understand one more thing. Yeah. Declarative UI is another reason why, you might look at, or the differences between jQuery and Angular. And once again, I talked about that previously, and we're going to go through an example. But declarative UI, it just means that like everything that you need to know about what's happening is declared in the UI. It's kind of spelled out for you. Mm-hmm. And so you can have the sense that there's probably a model, and there's a controller, and that this is a drop-down, and this submits this to this. And so it's all kind of listed in the UI. And so when you read it, you have a sense of what's going on without even, peeking at the JavaScript. Yes. You can't say the same for jQuery. No, not at all. I mean, I was working on a large team project where essentially the page itself was body with 2 tags inside there, and then we were injecting thousands of elements through jQuery. Debugging that was an absolute nightmare. But had you seen something like this, you can immediately see the layout, the skeleton, what the project architects had in mind before we even got to building the project. Yeah, and you get a sense of like what something should do. Yeah. Or like, oh, I see this as a repeater. It's probably going to be taking data and repeat. That's right. So you can start to see those things. And so, and again, declarative UI, for me, it's a beautiful thing. It also means it's one way I can communicate with you easier. I agree. You've got a distinct model layer, and it's not the DOM. And so a lot of times when people are working in jQuery, they'll put things in the DOM in terms of saving the model. And I guess what I mean by that is think of a carousel where you have a selected item. Mm-hmm. Often someone will put in the DOM in a class selected or active or whatever. Apply that style. And they'll apply that style, but they also use that class. They'll check for that class for business logic. Yeah. Right? And so now you're starting to kind of really confuse those. Everything together. Yeah, you're coupling them, and you're saying like, oh, obviously there's model logic in the DOM, and now the DOM stateful, and it's all these kind of things. And so you need to think about those things a little bit. In Angular, you have a model layer. It's very distinct from the DOM, and you're just binding to it. So it sounds like this is essentially the separation of concerns that you were talking about earlier. Yeah, completely. So, I'm going to do a quick little demo here, and I'm going to just look at, I'm going to open up Dave's project really quickly, and we're going to look at the UI, and I'm just going to show you the finished that we have on the repo for the Angular, and just show you the UI, and just kind of talk just a little bit about just what it means, what I mean by declarative, and how you can even look at those things and say, okay, I understand kind of what's going on here. So I'm going to bring up...
pick apart my code.
Well, I'm not worrying about the code as much as, let's just go into index.html. So let me do this. So if we're looking at, Dave's example, we have typical markup, right? Nothing's really out of the ordinary. And if I was to look at this just from, scanning it top down, I would say, okay, I know I have a list of evangelists. Oh, there's a form here. I'm guessing that, this form at some point will be submitted, but I don't see anything tied in the DOM. Nothing in the DOM tells me that this is what it does.
Yeah, really. There's got to be some function somewhere that's doing this, but where am I going to find this function in which JavaScript file?
It's one of those kind of things until I go to the bottom and I say, okay, well, he's, imported jQuery and now he has his assets. And so now I have to go look at that file and I need to figure out, okay, what kind of behavior is in that file? And, how is he attaching or associating the behavior with any of these kind of DOM elements or with the view? And so it starts to confuse those things a little bit. At least for me. And, once you work with jQuery quite a bit, like this is how it works. This is what you do. And there's nothing wrong with that. But, if you're working on a project that's fairly large, like you mentioned before, I would love to know that this form is going to be saving somewhere. And I would love to know the name of the function because I don't want to have to dig through your code.
Yeah.
I want to search through the file folders for that function and just find it.
Right, because right now you don't know if there's something specifically in the JavaScript that's specifically looking for form, or maybe there's something looking for all forms or all paragraphs, or maybe even something that targets a specific ID or class. Right now we don't know any of that. So it could be quite a mess as we start to grow. Yeah,
but if we start to look at, in the Angular folder, if we start to look at the finished, somewhat finished project, you can start to go down and you can see right at the beginning, okay, anytime you see an Angular, you see basically a data attribute property, ng, that's namespaced to Angular. So ng-anything has to do with Angular.
Yes.
And so that's a great way of just identifying, oh, okay, well, ng dash, min length, what does this mean? I can go look it up. I know it's Angular related.
It's documented somewhere.
Somewhere I can look it up. If you don't know what it does, you can search for it. And so this is what I mean by it extends HTML, is that it's adding these items as you go along. And so you start to see, well, you have an app, right? An app's kind of like a top-level concept, and then you got a controller, right? And so I know, once we start to learn a little bit more about Angular, okay, I know that some business logic might be in here. When you see curly braces means that you are binding, and this is, very similar in a lot of languages. When you are binding to some kind of model value, right? And so here I'm binding to something called hello. I don't know where hello is, whatever, but I have an idea that I am bound to something.
Okay.
In JavaScript a lot, when you see the curly braces, that either means you're binding to something. Sometimes that has to do, you'll see it a lot in templating.
Yes.
Whether you're using like mustache or handlebars or any of those kind of things, it's obviously I'm bound to some value.
And those are other frameworks, correct?
Yeah. Well, mustache and handlebars are going to be for templating only.
Yes.
Yep. And so you start to look at, these kind of things. I go down, I see I have a list. You notice that I only have one li, and that one li here, that list element, is actually going to be considered my template for what I want to see. And so when I go in here, you'll see that I have, ng repeat. Yep. That basically means I'm going to repeat this item. There's values. You can see again that things are, bound, right? So I'm binding to something name, etc.
And you can actually start to remove some of this code too. I mean, we still have ID evangelist here. But because of the way we're doing this with Angular, you don't even need that ID because you're already using ng repeat and it's tied to the scope of that controller. Yeah, you don't have to go and look up something through DOM manipulation. That's right. You're already kind of assuming that scope by where you put in certain properties and certain, Angular attributes. You're already simplified it right there. Yeah. And then if you look at the form, for example, I can look at this form and I see, oh, okay, when it submits, well, you don't need to know much about JavaScript to understand
end that's submitting is going to, send the data to the form. Yeah, it's going to do something. And I have a function name. And you can start to see all of these things being listed out.
Yeah.
And so the idea of like, now we see ng model. Well, what does that mean? Maybe, maybe that's binding to some data. Yeah. And you go to the bottom of the page and then you see stuff that's being inserted. So this is what I mean by a declarative UI.
Yep.
And it's kind of great in that way because, if I'm looking at the form, for example, and I see a submit, normally, for us, typically anyways, depending on how you do it in jQuery, you might have put that on the button.
That's right.
You could also do that in Angular. There's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But it's that idea of like, there's nothing there. So really there's no behavior here.
Yeah, but right.
I see it, where it's declared.
And immediately you know that there's a function called add name that accepts one parameter called user. And immediately you can find it.
Yeah. So, once again, I'm going to walk through all these things and how you kind of construct them. But that's what I mean by a declarative UI. And that you can just go to it and you can read it and have a sense of like, okay, what's going on? So, going back to kind of AngularJS taxonomy, you saw a bunch of, attributes there and ng app, controller, submit, all sorts of things. So we're going to go through just some common kind of taxonomy just to explain it very, very quickly so that you get a sense of, okay, here's where I'm going. Because some of the problems in frameworks is that they call different things they have their own taxonomy. So I remember working in Backbone, and Backbone used to have something that was called a router. Then they changed the router to controller, so that, those kind of things. And so you need to understand the taxonomy of any framework that you're going to get into. And so if we're looking at just like some really high level taxonomy and some of the stuff we're not going to get into,
okay.
But, you're looking at a module. Now, modules are not anything that any of us should be if we're working on big kind of applications, most of us are used to the idea of keeping things modular.
Yeah.
Small, contained units of code. You might think of a module in terms of a unit of code.
Or a container, maybe.
A container, depending on what you're building and how you're building it.
Yeah.
But regardless of the framework or the approach, a module is always seen as a building block for something bigger.
Okay.
Right? So we can always kind of think of those kind of things in that way.
How does this affect the global namespace?
In terms of modules, modules you can name different things.
Right.
Right. So the beauty behind modules, and that's in any framework, that's you're using require.js, whatever, is that the idea of a module is that you basically instantiate it. It has its own namespace. Everything within it is contained. Therefore, you're not polluting the global namespace.
Perfect.
Right. So that's like a big thing, especially when you're starting to work in things like jQuery and stuff like that. It's making sure that everything's namespaced. So a module in Angular is basically organizational and reusable container for your different parts of your app.
Yep.
You could have a module for each feature if you wanted. We're just going to do a module for the whole thing because it's so simple.
Yeah.
But a module, the idea of different modules makes sense. If I'm looking at your site and you have a carousel at the top, I would expect a module for that.
Right.
If you have something that's on the left that's going to accept user input for a newsletter form, there might be a module for that.
Okay.
Those kind of things.
So it sounds like you could write a module and share it with me at some point, and I can even use it on my site without worrying about cluttering everything up too.
Yeah, depending on as long as you had the dependencies that I injected, right?
Yep.
So the other benefit, or one of the other terms I want to talk about just a little bit is controller. And the controller is a business logic usually for views. And so there's a lot of things about where do you actually put in things like DOM manipulation and things like that. You don't put in the controller. The controller is just about business logic.
Yeah.
And so for the controller, it's all about are things being added to a model? Am I calling a service? That kind of stuff. Business logic.
Kind of like the middleman between the view and the data itself.
Yep. So again, we talked a little bit about directives. You won't see them in here, but directives, they extend HTML. You often see them as kind of like widgets.
Yeah.
And they have their own kind of like how you approach them, how you put them on the page, things like that.
So something like ng repeat, that'd be an example of a directive?
No, a directive would be something that's completely namespaced a little bit different. And it's way more robust.
Okay.
Yeah. We're not doing a lot of like, at least in this example, we're not doing a crazy amount of DOM manipulation.
Right.
So we don't need to write something too custom there. You also have something like services.
Okay.
again, where some people, I mean, you could use a bunch of different things, services, resources, whatnot, but it's usually reusable business logic independent of views. So when you think of services, it's like the idea of a proxy of calling out to something and getting some data back might be, the idea of a service.
Yeah.
Right? If you want to keep your data on the server, for example, and, you want to save to and from and always sync it with that, you might be using something as a service. Right? In our example, we're just going to show you a very basic how do you get and how do you post. We're not going to get too much into services.
Yeah.
But, those are some of the common kind of like taxonomies that you're getting into when you start dealing with Angular. Now, there's a whole bunch more. And if you go to their site, they have really, really great documentation.
Absolutely.
So you can just walk through and kind of start to read and start to see what things are called.
Yeah, definitely.
And those kind of things. But for our case, what we're dealing with today is kind of just the left-hand side, and it's going to be module and controllers.
Yep.
So we're really just focusing on kind of the bare kind of basics for this. So I just want to talk about AngularJS bootstrapping. And I think it's important to understand this process a little bit. And by bootstrapping, I mean, what happens when you put when you actually put the script in, the Angular library or framework script in, what happens at that point? What is it doing? What is it expecting to see? And so if you're looking at AngularJS bootstrapping, there's a whole bunch of diagrams that you can search for. I did a really bad one.
Ooh, look at that.
Yeah, not that pretty, but it gives you a sense of like
simplicity is key. I like it though.
What is happening. So let's say you're going to start an AngularJS project. You're going to do it from scratch like I'm going to show you. You're going to insert the library, whether it's from or a framework, whatever, whether it's from a CDN or whether it's local. So, you put it in the page at some point, right? So let's say your page, you refresh your page, what happens? Well, okay, AngularJS is getting downloaded if you use the CDN, let's say, for example, right? And your HTML page is completely loaded, right? So once that happens, what Angular does is it kind of goes through your DOM and it looks for ng app. And it's looking for that item because that's kind of the entry point. That's the application entry point.
Yep.
And it's saying, okay, this is the application, and it sets ng app as root of the app. So wherever you put ng app, whatever element you put it on, if you put it on the HTML, if you put it on the body, if you put it on a section within the body, whatever you do.
Yeah, maybe you don't want your entire page to be an Angular application.
Maybe not. Maybe it's just a section. You know what I mean? So it looks at that and it says, this is the element I'm operating on. This is the scope of the app, basically. Yep. And that's important to note because in other frameworks, sometimes you need to pass that in. If you're looking at Backbone, for example, and you're creating a view, you've got to pass in the element it is working on or it is associated with, right? Yeah. So this is kind of Angular's way of just kind of going through the DOM and it's saying, okay, here's ng app, here's the root of my app. And then it goes and it creates the injector for dependency injection, right? And dependency injection, again, is the idea of that any dependencies that you need, and dependencies can be things like services, it can be other libraries, it can be other, functionality, stuff that you're dependent on, right? It gets injected. And so you'll start to see this as a pattern throughout when we start to walk through the code a little bit. And then it creates that scope object. Right, and so the scope object, again, is what I'm saying by the element that you put the ng root, it sees that as a scope. That's the view,
scope.
Context. Yep,
like
that's a context.
If you will.
Yep. And then what it'll do at that point, once it's kind of like figured that stuff out, it's going to traverse the DOM, and it's going to find out all those other things that you've listed that have the ng prefix.
Right.
And so it's going to find all the directives, it's going to find all the bindings, it's going to find all the models.
Yep.
It's going to do all of that stuff.
It kind of listens in for them at that point.
It's going and it's finding those because it knows that within the scope of this app, there's all this stuff that I need to account for.
Okay.
Right? And then at that point, you're basically waiting for changes on the model and it updates the binding on change of model. So once it's kind of figured out where everything is, it understands the bindings that are made, all that kind of stuff, it's now kind of actively waiting for these changes no matter how they occur, right? And then whether it's user input or whether it comes from a service or, an API or whatever, and then it'll update the bindings on that. And so that's where you get that kind of two-way binding going in, where the data is updating, but if you change it in the view, it'll update it as well.
I like it.
So that's kind of the initial bootstrapping of Angular, and it's important to know that because you can start to put in some things, and I'll show you an example when we start getting into the code, where if you don't declare something like an ng app, well, nothing else works. So it's always looking for these little things that you need to do and sequence of events because it looks for that, and then that's kind of its entry point. And then everything else is, along the lines of growing from there. So there's a bunch of resources that you can look at. These are some of my favorites for Angular. Again, you can search for Angular and you'll find so much information. But over at egghead.io, who I think that site was originally created by John Lindquist, who's really, really smart and talented.
Yes.
Not that anyone else isn't. The guy is just...
We're trying to say about us.
The guy is just on point.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say he's on point. You can take a look, and there's really good video tutorials over there. There's a definitive guide that I found the other day. Actually, I listed it twice. I liked it so much.
Yeah,
Didn't realize I put it in. It's like Angular JS in 10,000 words or less.
Okay.
And it's really good.
It's a novel.
It's one of those things that you could spend a Saturday and look at it and read it and get up and running and be like, by the end of Saturday, be like, okay, I can do this. I got a handle on it.
Yeah.
And I don't think you could have said that before with Angular. I think Angular was, quite a while ago.
Overwhelming.
Yeah, one of the other ones we listed that you brought up that I didn't even realize was that there's, Angular code snippets.
Absolutely.
Right? So when I took a look at these from John Papa, they're great because they basically, the code snippets give you kind of like snippets you need to do things that you do commonly in Angular all the time, like create controllers, create your module, whatever you need. So definitely look at the code snippets. There's a little bit of a couple of steps I think that you need to kind of follow to get installed.
But once you get it installed and you start running with Angular, it's well worth your time. Yeah,
it's one of those things that'll save you a lot of time because you just copy, paste, whatever. You just click it and you're done. There's also along the same lines. There's a style guide.
I cannot recommend that enough.
Yeah,
it really helps you to actually understand how Angular works.
Gotcha. It gives you, it gives you that sense of what has the responsibilities of everything, what everything has, right? There's also, you can get templates for it too. And again, there's resources we're not necessarily going to cover, but you can get, if you're working in Visual Studio, you can go get, single page app templates for Angular, for MeanStack, for things like that. And so, that will get you up and running quite quickly. If you want to go and do it in that way. And again, the comprehensive guide in 10,000 words, can't say enough about it. It's listed twice.
Sounds like we got some good resources there.
Yeah, there's a ton of resources. But, if you're on Twitter, two people that I recommend following who are amazing in terms of Angular JS. One is going to be John Lindquist, and the other one is Joel Hooks. And he's really great. And they talk a lot about Angular. They produce a lot of content for the community. So those are two people that I know I personally follow who always have really great content.
Okay.
So I think we're going to leave it at that, just in terms of, introduction to taxonomy. And then in the next session, we're just going to start converting that app. And we're going to go, I showed you the finished example, but I'm going to try to walk through and go bit by bit and add in piece by piece and that kind of thing. So you can start to see things, coming alive a little bit more with Angular. And then by the end of the next hour, we should have, your very first simple Angular app. And it's a really great starting point. Now that you'll have that, the jumping point of actually digging in and understanding all the stuff will feel so much easier.
All right, look forward to getting my hands dirty with some of this code.
Getting dirty. It's going to be fun. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll see you guys shortly.
See you in a bit.